Michael had always been the kind of person who believed that no matter how hard life became, family should always come first. And when he received the news that his father David's health had taken a serious turn, he knew deep in his heart that it was his responsibility to step up and take care of him, no matter what challenges it might bring. David had worked all his life as a mechanic, raising Michael with steady hands and a kind heart. And though the years had added wrinkles to his face and a weakness to his body, the love he carried for his son never changed. So when the doctor told Michael that David could no longer live alone in his small house, Michael made the decision right away to bring him into his own home, a modest place in a quiet suburban neighborhood where he lived with his supportive wife Jennifer. It was not an easy decision as their home was small, their schedules were busy, and caring for someone sick required energy and patience. But Michael and Jennifer agreed that love was worth more than convenience. And so one weekend they drove to David's house, packed his belongings into boxes, and carried them into the home where new memories would now begin. The first night David spent in Michael's house was filled with quietness. He lay in a room Jennifer had decorated with fresh sheets and soft pillows, and though his body was weak, his eyes were filled with gratitude as he whispered to his son, "Thank you, Michael?" Words that Michael would carry in his heart as both a blessing and a reminder of why he had made this choice. In the days that followed, their lives slowly shifted to a new rhythm. Michael woke up earlier to help his father eat breakfast. Jennifer prepared warm soups and soft bread that would be easy for him to swallow. And during afternoons, Michael sat with David on the porch, talking about simple things like the weather, memories from the past, or the sound of birds in the trees. And though these conversations seemed ordinary, they carried a weight of love that words could hardly describe. Yet as beautiful as this bond was, not everyone welcomed the sight of David moving into the neighborhood, because across the street lived Karen, a woman who always seemed to be watching through her curtains, a woman whose eyes followed every small change, whether it was Michael's trash bin not perfectly aligned, or Jennifer's car parked slightly to the side. And when she noticed David being carried into the house, she did not see a sick father being cared for by a loving son. She only saw something that bothered her sense of order, something that did not fit into her narrow view of what the street should look like. At first, Michael did not pay attention to her stares, for he was too busy arranging doctor visits, adjusting his work schedule, and making sure his father felt comfortable. But Jennifer noticed the way Karen would linger by her mailbox longer than necessary, or the way she would cross the street slowly, pretending to walk her dog but really just observing the movements inside their home. Michael brushed it off when Jennifer mentioned it, saying gently, "She's just curious. Don't worry about it," because he believed that kindness and patience could solve most problems. But what he did not know was that Karen's curiosity was already turning into judgment, and judgment into whispers. She began to speak to neighbors at the small corner store, asking questions like, "Do you know who that man is living with, Michael? Or have you seen all the new visitors coming to his house?" As if a father moving in with his son was a scandal to be dissected, some neighbors ignored her, some shrugged, and a few even gave Michael kind words when they saw him. But Karen seemed to feed on the idea that something was wrong, and each day her glances grew colder, as though she was preparing to act on her suspicions. For Michael, however, life was too full to notice the growing storm, because he was pouring himself into the simple daily acts of love, adjusting David's pillows, carrying him to the garden for sunlight, sitting quietly when his father was too tired to talk, and holding back his own tears when he saw the man who once carried him, now needing to be carried. He reminded himself that this was not a burden but an honor, a chance to give back even a small piece of what had been given to him all his life, and Jennifer's steady presence reminded him that he was not alone. At night, when the house grew still, Michael often sat by the window, looking across at the glowing porch light of Karen's house, feeling the weight of her stare even when he could not see her. But he chose silence because his heart told him that what mattered most was not the opinion of others but the care of his father. And yet silence can sometimes allow misunderstandings to grow, and though Michael's days were filled with love and purpose, a shadow was forming across the street, a shadow that would soon test his patience, his courage, and his belief in kindness. Part one of their journey was filled with new beginnings, both beautiful and heavy, like a seed planted in soil, not yet knowing the storms that would come, but still holding on to the hope that love would be enough to weather anything. The weeks moved slowly, and though Michael's life was full of exhaustion and responsibility, He never once regretted bringing his father into his home, because every small smile from David, every thankful glance, reminded him that love was more powerful than difficulty. Yet even as he focused on caring for his father, the uneasiness in the neighborhood continued to grow, especially with Karen across the street, who seemed unable to look away from their house, her suspicious eyes always searching for something to confirm the story she had built in her mind. Jennifer noticed it more than anyone, the way Karen would walk past at odd hours, pretending to water her plants but really just standing still, watching, and she whispered to Michael one evening, "It feels like she's waiting for us to make a mistake." And though Michael sighed deeply, he replied with calm patience, "We haven't done anything wrong, and we won't, so let her wait. Our focus is Dad, nothing else." But sometimes, even when nothing wrong is done, those who are determined to see trouble will create it themselves, and Karen was slowly reaching that point, her thoughts shaping into action, her conviction hardening until it felt like truth to her alone. One Sunday afternoon, the air was quiet, the sun warm but not harsh, and Michael decided to take his father outside into the backyard, gently wheeling his chair so David could breathe fresh air and hear the birds, because even small moments like this lifted his father's spirit, giving him a spark of life that illness could not completely take away. And as Michael leaned down to tuck the blanket around David's shoulders, he felt proud, not because life was easy, but because he was able to give back to the man who had given him everything. But across the fence, unseen at first, stood Karen, her arms crossed tightly, her face drawn into a frown that carried more than disapproval. It carried a decision. She stepped closer, her voice sharp as she spoke over the wooden boards. "You can't just bring people here like this. This is a respectable neighborhood." And though her words stung, Michael turned slowly, keeping his tone calm, because he did not want to upset his father. "This is my father," he explained gently. "He is sick and I am taking care of him, that's all." But Karen did not soften. Instead, she shook her head, her voice louder now. "I don't believe that. I see different faces coming and going, and I don't feel safe with strangers here." Michael's chest tightened, but he held his ground, replying, "The people you see are nurses and friends. Nothing more. There is no danger here, only family." Yet instead of listening, Karen's hand went to her pocket, and in a moment that made Michael's stomach drop, she pulled out her phone and began dialing. David, confused by the tension and the sight of flashing fingers across the screen, whispered weakly, "Son, what's happening?" And Michael, though calm on the outside, felt a storm rising inside him because he knew exactly what she was doing, and he could hear her words clear and cold as she spoke into the phone. "Yes, I'd like to report something suspicious. There's a man here who doesn't belong, and I don't feel safe in my neighborhood." The words pierced Michael like a blade, not because they were true, but because of the weight they carried, the way they turned love and care into suspicion and threat in the ears of those who did not know the truth. Jennifer, who had been watching from the kitchen window, rushed outside, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Karen, please stop. This is his father. He is ill, can't you see?" But Karen turned her back, still speaking into her phone with conviction, as though she was doing a duty rather than causing pain. Michael placed a hand gently on his father's shoulder, whispering, "It's all right, Dad, stay calm. I'm here." But inside he could feel the ache of helplessness, because no matter how much he explained, no matter how many documents he had to prove the truth, the fact that a call was being made turned everything upside down, placing suspicion where there should have only been compassion. Minutes later, the faint sound of sirens grew louder, filling the street with a heavy silence, as curtains shifted and neighbors peeked out, some curious, some worried, and Michael stood tall by his father's side, determined not to let fear show on his face. Though his heart raced as the flashing lights grew closer, Karen stood proudly on the curb now, her phone still in her hand, her body language speaking of satisfaction as though she had achieved some kind of victory, while Michael's mind raced with thoughts of how to protect his father from the stress of what was coming. Jennifer placed a hand in his, squeezing tightly, and whispered, "We'll tell the truth, Michael, that's all we can do." And he nodded, though his throat felt tight with the unfairness of it all. David, weak in his chair, looked around with confusion, his voice breaking as he asked softly, "Why is she doing this, son? Why doesn't she believe?" And Michael's heart ached as he bent low, whispering, "Because some people choose not to see the truth, Dad, but I promise you, we will get through this." The sirens stopped, the cars pulled up, And the moment that had been building for weeks finally arrived, a moment where love and prejudice stood face to face, and Michael knew that whatever happened next, it would leave a mark not only on his family, but on the neighborhood that had quietly watched the storm form across their quiet street. The flashing lights painted the quiet street in shades of red and blue, and though the sound of sirens faded into silence as the police cars stopped in front of Michael's home, the weight of their arrival pressed down on the entire neighborhood, drawing curious eyes to the windows and doorways, as neighbors peeked out to see what was happening. Michael stood tall beside his father's chair, his hand resting gently on David's shoulder, trying to steady his own heartbeat even as his mind raced with worry, because he knew that this entire situation had been created out of misunderstanding and suspicion. Yet he also knew that once the authorities became involved, words carried even more weight and he could not afford to let frustration take over. Jennifer walked out to stand beside him, her hand slipping into his for courage, her face calm though her heart trembled with anger at the unfairness of the moment, while David, frail and confused, looked around with tired eyes, whispering softly, "Why are they here, son?" "I don't understand," and Michael bent close to answer gently. "It's all right, Dad, they will listen, I'll explain everything." Karen, meanwhile, stood proudly on the curb, her arms crossed, her chin lifted, her expression showing satisfaction as though she had accomplished some kind of victory, and her voice carried across the street as she told the arriving officers, "That's him, that's the man I told you about. I don't feel safe with him here." The officers, 2 men and a woman, stepped carefully toward the house, their expressions professional but not hostile, and as they drew closer, they immediately noticed the blanket-wrapped figure of David sitting weakly in the chair, his pale face and slow breathing making it clear that he was not a threat, but an ill man in need of care. One officer turned to Michael, speaking in a calm voice. "Sir, we received a call about a suspicious person at this address. Can you explain the situation?" Michael nodded quickly, holding his father's hand tighter for strength, and replied with steady words, "Yes, of course, this is my father. His name is David. He has been very sick and he can no longer live alone, so my wife and I brought him here to take care of him. Everything you see is only family, nothing more." Jennifer stepped forward as well, her voice firm though her eyes glistened with emotion. "This is his home now, he belongs here. We've been caring for him day and night and there is nothing suspicious, only a family trying to look after one another." The officers exchanged glances, their posture softening as they looked at the fragile man in the chair, then back at Michael's steady eyes, and one of them asked politely, "Do you have any identification for your father, maybe medical records?" Without hesitation, Michael nodded, rushing inside for a moment before returning with a folder of papers, the hospital documents, prescriptions, and even David's driver's license, which he handed over calmly. As the officers flipped through the pages, it became clear that the story matched perfectly, and the tension that had hovered in the air began to shift. Though across the street, Karen's expression turned from pride to defensiveness as she realized the truth was not bending in her favor. One officer finally closed the folder and returned it to Michael, speaking in a clear and steady tone. "Sir, everything checks out. There is no problem here. You are simply taking care of your father, and that is exactly what any good son should do." Relief washed over Michael and Jennifer like a wave, though exhaustion clung to them as well. And David, who had been silently watching, managed a weak smile, whispering, "I told you, son, truth always wins." But the officers were not finished, because one of them turned toward Karen, who still stood with arms crossed, and said firmly, "Ma'am, there is no crime here, no danger, and no reason for us to have been called. This family is doing nothing wrong, and this call has wasted resources that could have been used for real emergencies." Karen shifted uncomfortably, her face red with embarrassment, though she still muttered softly, "I was only trying to protect the neighborhood." But the officer's tone carried no patience now. "Protecting the neighborhood does not mean harassing your neighbors without cause. Please do not make such calls again unless there is real danger." The neighbors, who had been watching from their porches and windows, now stepped back quietly, some shaking their heads at Karen, some exchanging glances with sympathy toward Michael. And slowly the truth began to ripple through the street, softening the shadows that had been cast by weeks of whispers and suspicion. Michael, though tired, remained calm, choosing not to raise his voice or throw anger at Karen because he knew his father was watching, and he wanted to show him strength through patience, not through rage. Jennifer squeezed his hand tightly, whispering, "It's over now, Michael. She can't hurt us with her words anymore. And though Michael nodded, his eyes lingered on his father, making sure that David felt safe again in the home they had built for him. The officers offered a few more words of reassurance before leaving, their cars pulling away until the lights faded into the distance, leaving behind only the quiet hum of crickets and the soft rustling of leaves, as if nature itself wanted to restore peace to the street. Karen retreated into her house, closing the door quickly, her curtains drawn tighter than ever, while Michael gently wheeled his father back inside, whispering as they crossed the doorway, "You're safe, Dad, you're home, and no one can take that away." Inside, Jennifer helped David settle into his chair, placing a warm blanket around him while Michael sat close, his hand never leaving his father's. And though the night had been heavy with tension, the family's bond felt stronger than ever, because they had faced suspicion with truth, prejudice with patience, and fear with love. In that moment, Michael understood something deeper, that no matter how loud mistrust might be, the quiet strength of compassion could rise above it. And though Karen's actions had brought pain, they had also revealed the power of standing firm in love, and that was something that no call, no stare, and no misunderstanding could ever take away from them. The days after the police cars left were strangely quiet, as though the street itself was taking a deep breath, and Michael could feel the shift in the way people looked at him. No longer with suspicion but with understanding, because word had spread quickly about what had really happened, and the truth had a way of shining brighter than gossip. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now began to come forward, some knocking gently on the door with small offerings of food, others stopping by with words of encouragement, and one elderly couple even brought a quilt they had made, saying softly, "For your father, to keep him warm." Michael was touched by these gestures, not because they erased the pain of what had happened, but because they reminded him that most people, when given the chance to see clearly, chose kindness over suspicion. Jennifer noticed the change too, and she smiled more in those days, though she still carried a quiet watchfulness in her eyes whenever she glanced across the street, where Karen's curtains remained firmly drawn, her figure no longer lingering on the curb or by the mailbox, as though she had finally retreated into silence after the embarrassment of her actions. But even in her silence, Michael chose not to feel bitterness, telling Jennifer one evening, "We can't control what she thinks, but we can control how we live, and I'd rather fill this house with peace than waste my heart on anger." David, though weak, seemed comforted by the new warmth flowing into the house, and he often whispered to Michael, "I told you love would win," words that brought tears to Michael's eyes, because they reminded him of all the sacrifices his father had made in his younger years, and now it was his turn to give back with patience and care. Each day, Michael continued the routine of helping his father with meals, medicine, and short walks in the garden. But now those walks often included neighbors who stopped to chat, offering friendly words that carried no judgment, only genuine respect for the devotion they saw in a son caring for his father. Jennifer, too, found strength in this, and though she had been shaken by the unfairness of that night when Karen made the call, she now stood taller, proud of the way they had handled the situation with calmness, proud that their home had remained a place of love rather than becoming a battlefield of anger. Even the children of the neighborhood began waving to David. When they saw him sitting on the porch, their small voices calling out cheerful greetings, and though David's body was frail, his smile grew brighter each time, as if the kindness of strangers gave him new energy to keep going. Michael, watching all of this, realized that while Karen had tried to isolate them through suspicion, her actions had actually brought the community closer to them, revealing who truly stood by their side, and this thought filled him with a quiet gratitude. He still worked hard, balancing his job with the endless tasks of caregiving, but the weight no longer felt so heavy, because love was now being reflected back to him in small ways, like a meal left on the porch or a neighbor offering to mow the lawn. One evening, as the sun painted the sky with soft shades of orange and pink, Michael sat beside his father in the backyard, the air filled with the sound of birds settling for the night, and David reached out with a trembling hand, gripping his son's fingers as he whispered, "You've given me more than I ever asked for, Michael, and no matter what comes, I want you to remember that you've done right by me." Tears welled in Michael's eyes, but he held them back, smiling as he said, "You gave me everything first, Dad. I'm just returning a part of that love now." Jennifer, watching them from the porch, felt her own heart swell with emotion, knowing that though life had tested them, They had answered with courage and compassion, and that was something no one could ever take away. As the days turned into weeks, Karen remained hidden, her voice absent from the community, and though some whispered that she had been humbled by the way the police corrected her, Michael did not concern himself with her silence, because he understood that some battles are not fought with words or anger, but with patience and the steady example of living rightly. The neighborhood, once unsettled by her whispers, now saw the truth with their own eyes, and many quietly admired the dignity with which Michael had handled himself, never raising his voice, never responding with cruelty, only standing firm in love. For Michael, the greatest reward was not the shifting opinions of neighbors, but the peace in his father's eyes. The knowledge that David could spend his final days surrounded not by fear or hostility, but by the warmth of a son's care and a community's quiet support. One night, as he sat by the window, looking across the street at Karen's darkened house, Michael whispered to himself. We rose above it, and he felt a calmness settle over him, a calmness born not from victory over another person, but from the certainty that he had chosen the path of love over bitterness. In the end, this was the lesson that stayed with him, Jennifer, and even the neighbors who had watched the events unfold. That prejudice may cause moments of pain, but love, patience, and truth are stronger, and they will always leave the deeper mark. And so Michael continued each day, caring for his father with steady devotion, walking through his neighborhood with quiet dignity, and holding in his heart the knowledge that when faced with suspicion and unfairness, he had chosen not to let anger define him, but instead let love be the louder voice. And that choice became the true strength of his family's story, a strength that would echo long after the whispers had faded. As days passed, the rhythm of Michael's home became steadier, though it was far from easy, because taking care of his sick father meant waking up at night when David coughed, adjusting his diet when he lost appetite, and arranging new medicines after each doctor visit. Yet Michael carried this responsibility with patience, knowing that his father had once carried him through his own difficult childhood, and this thought alone gave him strength to continue. Jennifer was no less committed, balancing her work with the countless small acts of care that made their home warmer, like placing flowers in David's room, reminding him of the garden he once loved, or softly reading to him when his eyes grew too tired. And even though their days were exhausting, the love that filled the house created a kind of peace, a quiet reminder that family could turn even hardship into something meaningful. But outside the walls of their home, another story was forming, because Karen's eyes remained fixed on them like a shadow, and while Michael was too focused on his father to pay attention, Jennifer could feel the uneasiness in the air every time she saw Karen standing by her window or lingering by her mailbox for far too long. At first it was just stares, then whispers to neighbors. But soon Karen's tone grew sharper as she asked questions that carried an edge of judgment. Questions like, why are there so many cars in their driveway these days? Or do you even know who that man is they brought into their home? As though David's presence was a disruption rather than a natural part of family life. Some neighbors ignored her attempts to stir suspicion, but others grew curious, and Michael began to sense the change in how a few of them looked at him, though he still chose silence, believing it was better to stay focused on his father's health rather than feed into gossip.
Yet silence does not always stop trouble.
And Karen's uneasiness slowly hardened into a conviction that something was wrong, not because of anything real, but because she allowed her imagination to paint a story in which Michael and his family were outsiders, disturbing the calm of the street. One evening, while Michael was helping his father sit outside to enjoy the sunset, Karen walked by with her small dog, her eyes scanning David's fragile figure as though his presence was a crime, and though Michael smiled politely, she only tightened her lips and muttered something under her breath before walking away, leaving behind a heaviness that even David noticed. She doesn't seem very friendly, David whispered weakly, and Michael forced a gentle smile, replying, don't worry about it, Dad. Not everyone understands, but we'll be fine. Inside, though his heart felt heavy, because he did not want his father, already burdened with illness, to feel unwelcome in the very place he should have felt safe. Jennifer shared her husband's concern, telling him later that night, she's looking for something to complain about, Michael. I can feel it. But Michael held to his belief that kindness would be stronger than bitterness, and so he decided to continue focusing only on love and care, even as tension slowly brewed across the street. The following week, David's condition grew worse, and Michael spent hours on the phone with doctors. adjusting appointments, ordering medical equipment, and trying to keep his father comfortable, all while still working from home to provide for his family. And though exhaustion pulled at his body, his determination only grew stronger, because every smile from his father, every soft thank you reminded him that he was doing something deeply important. Yet as Michael worked to keep his home steady, Karen's whispers reached a new level, because she began to tell anyone who would listen that something strange was happening in Michael's house, that she saw unfamiliar people coming and going, even though those visitors were only nurses and friends offering support, and she even suggested that perhaps David was not really Michael's father at all, but someone suspicious who had been moved in quietly, an idea so far from the truth yet spoken with such certainty that it caused unease among those who were too distant to know the family personally. Jennifer tried to reassure Michael that people who mattered knew the truth, but she too could not help noticing the way Karen's eyes seemed to follow them, with increasing intensity, as if she were waiting for the right moment to turn her suspicion into action. The uneasiness grew so heavy that even the simple act of walking outside with his father felt watched, and though Michael told himself that his duty was to his father alone, a quiet worry grew in his chest, the worry that Karen's growing hostility might soon become something more. Yet Michael chose to stay gentle, continuing to wave politely when he passed her, even though she never waved back because he believed deep down that responding with anger would only make things worse, and that if he remained calm, perhaps her heart might soften one day. But he did not know that Karen's heart had already hardened, and that she was already imagining herself as the protector of the neighborhood, convinced that she was the only one who saw the truth about Michael's home, and that it was her responsibility to do something about it. For Michael, the days of Part 2 were filled with love, care, and the steady rhythm of family life. But under the surface, the tension grew sharper, like a quiet storm gathering on the horizon, and though he tried to shield his father from worry, he could not shake the feeling that soon the peace they had built with so much effort would be challenged in a way that none of them were prepared for.